Appreciate it. Okay. Well, welcome again, everybody, to this session of CLI summer events. We're very fortunate this summer to have been joined in Tempe, Arizona by Kateryna Ruban, who is a PhD candidate at NYU, so my PhD institution as well. So we have a shared kind of intellectual kinship. And Kateryna was kind enough to accept our invitation to present today on her research. The research is her dissertation research, which is provisionally, right? There's a lot of time when you're writing the dissertation to think about the title, but provisionally entitled The Abortion Question and Soviet Modernity, Doctors and Patients in a Soviet Ukrainian Hospital, the 1940s to the 1960s. It's an exploration of Soviet public health care, and particularly maternity care and abortions, and the role of doctors in the Soviet proclaimed emancipation of women. I know that Kateryna has also written about these issues in the kind of contemporary period in contemporary Ukraine. So I'm very excited to hear from her about this research. And if you could join me in welcoming her, I would appreciate it. You know, however you want to do it. You could be with the reaction emoji, or if you want to turn your camera on and clap. Thank you. That's great. And now I turn it over to Kateryna Ruban.
Thank you, Irina. Thank you for inviting me to give this presentation, and thank you for this brief introduction. And I will actually start from another brief introduction. So my dissertation is about abortions in the Soviet Union after the Second World War. And it's a microhistory of a doctor, an obstetrician gynecologist who came to work in a small hospital in Transcarpathia. And when I started doing my research, I wanted to have a very broad context for this microhistory. So I started from the beginning. And for me, the beginning was the 1920 decree and intense debates about it. So I started reading everything that was published about abortions even before 1917. And in the 20s, and there are a lot of exciting and quite easily accessible sources. Sorry. And at some point I realized that what I wrote about pre-Soviet and early Soviet period is not that necessary and well connected to my dissertation, to the events of 50s and 60s. So now I like to think about those pieces on early Soviet abortion history as something like my parallel project. So today I'm going to explain how it happened that this Soviet Union was the first country in the world that legalized abortions. In the Soviet example, we can see the first politicization of abortion. Before 1917 and in the 20s and 30s, enormous amount of knowledge about abortion was produced. So abortion was, let's say, invented, made up as a political task. It was also a part of the large-scale changes of that time, when doctors turned from treating an individual patient to treating the population, treating the so-called social diseases of population like abortion. The politicization of abortion immediately posed a very ambitious task: to find the root of this problem and ultimately to eliminate it through intense intervention from above. And this is exactly what happened during Stalinism. And I will talk about it, and then I will briefly introduce my dissertation arguments about the late Stalinism and what happened after the death of Stalin. And then I will jump to the present day situation and why I think that the 1920 Soviet decree is still important today in this current moment of uncertainty about the future of women's reproductive rights. And I have a PowerPoint presentation that I want to share. Maybe I hope it's going to be easier to follow for you my talk. In the early 20th century, abortion was one of the most debated medical procedures in both Western Europe and the Russian Empire. Doctors, journalists, and political thinkers discussed social theories that accounted for the rise in abortion numbers, illustrated by dreadful individual stories. Abortion had become a symptom of female emancipation and the transition from traditional village life to the uncertainty of the city, concentrating all the features of the modern life, both its positive and negative sides. The abortion debates remained the prerogative of doctors, who definitely had the most to say about it, because they actually performed abortions. Most of the doctors who presented themselves as experts who could talk about abortion never mentioned that they did this, but it was an open secret. The so-called abortion question, abortный вопрос, was a part of the woman question, женский вопрос, and many other questions about the emancipation, one of the questions that were seen as urgent and to be solved here and now. And the tone of the doctors' meetings and writings suggested that there could be no more delays. The heated debates centered around laws that made any surgical procedure or drugs that aimed to end a pregnancy a matter of criminal prosecution for both the medical practitioner and the woman. While in many European countries, politicians and doctors lamented the population, especially after World War I, and consequently adopted strict laws against contraceptives and abortion, they faced opposition and calls for decriminalization, first of all from feminist movements. In the late imperial Russia, it was not women's groups, but high-profile scientific societies of male doctors and lawyers that began putting the issue of abortion at the center of public attention. For them, abortion was an exemplary case for demonstrating the need of changes in Tsarist Russia, changes demanded by общественность, or educated society, and doctors were one of its main spokespeople. Their views of abortion were shaped by their political agenda, as they positioned themselves as representatives of modern knowledge and expertise, set between the Tsar's outdated autocracy and the people's backwardness. So in the late Russian Empire, it was doctors, not feminist groups, who turned abortions into a highly politicized topic before 1917, and doctors were insisting on following women's needs and interests. Professional knowledge and skills of an educated doctor and ignorance of babka, lay midwife. And you can see this from this illustration that was used for the poster. So babka was always presented as this dangerously ignorant, using backward barbaric methods like herbs and vaginal injections. And actually, it was an exaggeration of babka's ignorance, because in the early 20th century, most of the babkas actually had some medical training, but that's the way how they were presented, as kind of witch doctors. So the dramatic contrast that could be detected in post-abortion complications and mortality aimed to show the safety of the surgical method of abortion when it was performed by a doctor using antiseptic techniques. And it was the most significant and widely promoted argument for decriminalization. Before 1920, the so-called old laws made doctors' expertise and skills useless, or at least put them under the threat of criminal prosecution. Proponents of decriminalization, both before and after 1917, drew a clear connection between the old political regime, its social ills and backwardness, and the pre-modern knowledge of babkas on the other hand. In 1913, abortion was put at the center of the public debates at the Congress of the Pirogov Society. The society was named after the famous surgeon Nikolai Pirogov, and was the collective voice of first public doctors. They saw their project of modernizing Russia as a civic service to the people, and at the same time a political struggle with autocracy in the name of the people. While most of the presenters at the Congress views abortion as evil, they still argued against the severe punishment for abortion for both women and doctors prescribed by the law. And the punishment was the deprivation of civil rights and either exile or a sentence to hard labor. The doctors at the Congress presented abortion as a social phenomenon, embedded into the economics of living conditions. Doctors aimed to bring the operation fully under their authority, without any interference from police, lawyers, or ultimately the state. The anticipated law would fully leave the decision to a doctor and the woman with no legal limitations. It was a radical political position, and of course, it was far from unanimous. One of the presentations was by Ilya Green, a doctor who would become an important figure in the Soviet obstetrics. And his ideas are important for understanding both the pre-Soviet and Soviet abortion debates. Green openly states that rich patients had access to safe abortions, thus making it clear that doctors aimed not to benefit financially from decriminalization, but to help the poor. To fight abortions, Green proposes large-scale social changes like introducing economic support for single mothers, abolishing the notion of out-of-wedlock children, and generally improving working-class living conditions. In his vision of the future, each woman, as a free citizen who has equal rights with men, shall not be turned into a reproductive machine. Criminal responsibility for abortion is, in his word, a restriction of personal freedom. And such a statement was very radical for the abortion debate. It was in 1913. And even if it was too radical to be a part of the society resolution, but it was still a benchmark that would not disappear from the horizon of political thinking in the next decades. So here abortion was a matter of individual rights. But at the same time, this woman who was an equal and free citizen, she was presented as a victim of her nature. Inexperienced, frightened, desperate, and also backward under the double burden of exploitation, uprooted from traditional morality, and easy prey for profit-seeking babkas. So this was the main dilemma of the abortion question. Women, conscious and free citizens equal to men, should have control over their reproduction. But at the same time, their consciousness, their сознание, was always impeded by social and economic conditions that undermined the autonomy of their decision. And this is the dilemma that would be seen through the decades of debating abortion in the USSR. What is also important is that even if doctors insisted on social causes of abortion, and they were portraying women of unprivileged classes, they still argued for abortion as a personal freedom and individual right for all women. And they brought this idea to Soviet healthcare, even if under the umbrella of a larger social question. There were many opponents of decriminalization. Most of them were the medical elite, professors of military medical academy close to the emperor. They presented abortion through the interest of the state, first of all through its demographic interests, and argued for more policing in the interest of the state. They opposed decriminalization from a point of view that undermined the ultimate basis of the abortion question. They rejected the social origin of abortion, seeing it as a constant of human nature that arises from complicated circumstances of individual lives, but cannot be reduced to social factors. The importance of the debate can be seen through Vladimir Lenin's reaction, which was published in his article, The Working Class and Neo-Malthusianism, in 1913 in Pravda newspaper. This article later became an essential introduction to almost every scholarly and popular text on abortion in the USSR in 20s and 30s. Here, Lenin criticized the laws against abortion and contraception as a part of the hypocrisy of the ruling class. And such prohibitions should be unconditionally abolished, as they were against the elementary democratic rights of men and women citizens. Lenin proclaimed the decriminalization of abortion one of the key demands to the late imperial government, but it took 3 years after the October Revolution until the legislative change was implemented in November 1920. The decree on the protection of women's health, issued in November 1920, reflected Lenin's stance on abortion as well as earlier pleas for decriminalization, but with some important modifications. The provisional nature of the decree was reflected in its preamble, which proclaimed that the Soviet state combats abortion by reinforcing the socialist regime and by making provisions for mother and child welfare that will lead to the gradual disappearance of the practice. But believing that repression in this field has not given the expected result, abortion should be fully legalized for the time being. Abortions were to be performed free of charge, but only on the premises of Soviet medical institutions and only by a doctor. Professional midwives, lay midwives, and even doctors who performed abortion for personal profit would be prosecuted. So what do we see in this decree? The decree was a decriminalization, but it was turned into a banner of Soviet progressive politics, but it doesn't say anything about female emancipation. The term right never once appeared in the decree, and quite logically, because abortion was explicitly referred to as evil, so women were its victims. Although earlier Lenin referred to abortion as one of the elementary democratic rights of women citizens. In the decree, abortion was seen through the social lens. It was a social phenomenon, a result of capitalist exploitation. Still, the decree went much further than such a definition. It offered a revolutionary stance, providing free abortions for all women, regardless of class and social background. So it was not a private individual matter, but universally accessible procedure for all Soviet women, part of the state care for women's health. Even if the idea that abortion was a part of female emancipation was not in the text, it was in the air. The decree was presented as a temporary measure in its preamble, but many doctors openly disagreed with it. And in the 20s, many doctors wrote that social arguments did not give the full picture of women's reasons to abort, and doctors disagreed that reasons for abortion would disappear in the future. The 1920 decree gave a new life to the abortion debate. On meetings of obstetricians and gynecologists in the 20s, abortion was the #1 question being discussed, and according to the statistics provided there, it was the leading operation in obstetrics and gynecology. The medical statistics on perforation of uterus and inflammations after abortions were used as the main argument in the ongoing debate on how to evaluate the decree. And most studies showed that abortion was a simple and safe procedure. Very soon after the decree, abortion fees were introduced according to women's social status, and they mean to provide more slots for the neediest women in the Soviet medical institutions. But at the same time, they were silently legalizing the figure of a greedy doctor and the babka who would benefit from women who were not able to get abortion for free. Departing from the universalism of the 1920 decree, the promise of free and safe abortion became a kaleidoscope of instructions that reflected the uncertainty about the revolutionary promises in the early 30s, in the context of the early Stalinism. The abortion fee questioned the goal to make every abortion a public, not a private matter. And now it was unclear what abortion was. Was it a universal welfare for women regardless of class? And was it a right, even if the word itself had not appeared? Or was it a service for profit that doctors were selling, even if on behalf of the state? Or was it a charity for the poorest, creating a way to regulate and limit their reproduction? In the early 30s, the term of fighting abortion, борьба abortами, started to appear in official documents. It was about fighting underground abortions performed by doctors, Basically, the goal was to eliminate private practice that was still thriving. And fighting abortion aimed to limit the autonomy of doctors, to establish control over doctors, and to create Soviet healthcare that was based on universal rules and fully transparent for the outside authorities. In June 1936, abortions were banned by the new law. The main argument of the ban was harm to women's health. The abortion decree, following the Constitution of 1936, proclaimed that the class struggle was over, classes were eliminated, and all Soviet women were united by their biological reproductive function. The state now guaranteed that it would provide all necessary political and economic conditions for all women to enjoy motherhood, thereby making biological reproduction a duty. If biological reproduction was a duty, it implied control and punishment, and women were to be punished by public condemnation and up to 300 rubles fine for repeated offenses. So women were no more victims of their backwardness, social conditions, or greedy medical practitioners. They were to be punished for seeking abortions. And the main argument of the ban was harm to women's health. Although all textbooks and medical studies published even in 1935, they praised safety of abortion in the hospitals and provided very small numbers of any complications. So what we see is that doctors' opinions did not matter. Only political arguments mattered, and doctors were seen as workers of the state who had to follow the directives and to explain them to the public. So they had to popularize the law. The Stalinist state is usually seen as a pronatalist, interested in human resources for the military and industrialization, while doctors are usually seen as merely a tool to execute state orders. There are a couple of books that argue that the Soviet doctor was just an instrument of biopolitics that served to expand the state control over women's bodies. In this way, the 1920 decree is considered as a kind of a revolutionary exception, with a gradual and persistent march toward the 1936 decree as a part of the modern state turn to population control. But did all doctors follow the law? Did doctors who considered abortion as a safe procedure and part of female emancipation and who continued to work, did they stop performing abortions? Did they fully lose their autonomy? Was it possible to preserve the legacy of the 20s within the Stalinist healthcare? And the very high numbers of underground abortions, did such numbers demonstrate women's determination to abort and doctors' willingness to perform abortions? So these were my questions when I started my dissertation research. And when I found the manuscript of memoir written by an obstetrician gynecologist who studied after the war, and she started to work in 1951, I saw a very different picture from that described in the books. And I started to do an archival research to see if I can show Soviet doctors and their patients, and therefore the Soviet state in general, from a bit different perspective than just pronatalist. Looking at the archives, they demonstrate the enormous effort to fight underground abortions, enormous efforts by the Minzdrav, by the Ministry of Public Health. It was the #1 task for the doctors. It was a task for special commissions that were created to supervise permissions for abortions due to medical reasons. But there were many challenges to establishing control over doctors. And the main one was that in most cases, it was impossible to identify if a woman who came to the hospital had a miscarriage or an underground abortion. So it was up to a doctor to decide if such a woman could be just an ordinary patient or a suspect. So through the archives and the memoir, I explore the autonomy of doctors, the autonomy and control from the Minzdrav and from the outside authorities like police and the KGB and the party over the doctor's work. And the main question of my microhistory is what it meant to be a Soviet female obstetrician gynecologist who had to serve the interest of an individual woman and at the same time who had to serve the interests of the state. Dr. Nina Holopatyuk, the main character of my story, in 1951 came to the small town of Irshava, which didn't have a hospital before the Soviets started building one in 1946. It's 1946 is when Transcarpathia was officially incorporated in the Soviet Union. And this is her what's called personal, I don't know the English word, like personal card in the hospital. So Nina positioned herself as a good Soviet doctor who was a representative of the state, not any kind of dissident. At the same time, she proudly described her mission to save women from dangers of underground abortions. And it's 1951 when abortions are banned. According to archival sources, Nina worked in an abortion commission, but in her memoir, she never mentioned this commission when she described abortions she performed. So abortion decisions in Irshava were hardly made within the official work of this commission. Also, she openly writes in the memoir that her colleague in this commission had some kind of a private practice at his home, providing services like abortions for his clients, mostly wives of local начальство, of local Soviet officials. In her memoir, Nina does not use terms like underground or illegal abortions, and she treated her patients without the mandatory interrogation required by the Minzdrav instructions in case of incomplete abortions and post-abortion complications. In the annual statistics, numbers of cases of illegal abortions sent to the prosecutor were very low, usually just 1 or 2, and numbers of so-called unidentified abortions, that could be either a miscarriage or an underground abortion, were quite high. So this actually demonstrates that Nina, or like any other district obstetrician gynecologist, had quite a lot of space to accommodate abortion numbers without a clear explanation to any authorities. For Nina, abortion was an ordinary medical procedure, like other gynecological operations. So she didn't even much focus on abortion. But at the same time, from her practice, I see that it was her manifestation of doctors' political mission to liberate women, among them also female doctors like herself, not only from the unwanted children, but also from the health risks or deaths brought by homemade abortive substances and Babka's methods. She describes that in Irshava hospital, nurses often asked her to perform an abortion during their working hours. So abortions were never perceived through the lens of the state interest or harm to women's health, so much exaggerated by popular press, brochures, and posters. The most interesting episode for me is when Nina even got pregnant just to have an abortion, because she wanted to feel and understand herself what abortion was as a medical procedure that she performed every day. So definitely it was quite unusual for a doctor whose task was to promote the joy of Soviet motherhood and to educate women about dangers of abortion. 2 years after Stalin's death, a quiet decision was made without any public discussion. And in November 1955, abortions were legalized. This law is usually seen as the main event and symbol of the end of Stalinism and the symbol of the soul. It provided women with the opportunity to decide by themselves the question of motherhood. And this wording was a return to the revolutionary spirit of the 1920s. But at the same time, there was a huge difference with the 1920 decree that provided free abortion for all women. Now the abortion procedure was performed for a fee, and women had to pay 50 or 100 rubles depending on their income. And the price for the procedure was quite high. For example, at that time, a nurse in Irshava hospital earned just 300 or 400 rubles. This exception in the Soviet healthcare, because it was an exception because all other services were free, turned the procedure into a profit and stimulated the kind of like a black market of abortion services in the hospital. Nina openly wrote that a colleague in her department was eager to perform abortions as he got money, he got bribes for the procedure. Being a member of the party, this colleague of Nina was strongly protected from any punishment. And about herself, she mentioned that she performed abortions as a friendly favor, but actually in an anonymous letter to the newspaper and to the Department of Health, she was also accused of taking bribes for abortions. So this actually also demonstrates another side of the autonomy of doctors in the USSR. In the law and in the anti-abortion propaganda of 50s and 60s, abortion was officially proclaimed as a matter of women's private life, вопрос личной жизни, or a private matter, личное дело. Any connection between social conditions and abortion was carefully avoided. This anti-abortion propaganda presented the procedure as women's personal grief, personal tragedy. It was all about either happiness or unhappiness. And it was a big change that pushed abortion into the gray zone of the private, and was a silent retreat from the previous social explanations and from the state promises of female emancipation. Abortion was not something that required much public attention and state intervention until perestroika, a very brief moment when abortion was again in the spotlight. In the West, high numbers of abortions in the Soviet Union were referred as abortion culture, a negative label for the entire Soviet history of abortions, used to represent all Soviet women as victims of the state and discredit legal abortions. Definitely, the history of abortions in the USSR is a history of unfulfilled promises. And abortion was one of many examples of the promise of new life when women would not have any reasons for abortion. But the Soviet legacy is important now because it shows that abortions was and can be a part of female emancipation. The Soviet legacy now prevents criminalization of abortion in the post-Soviet space. And there have been many attempts to do it. For example, in post-Soviet Ukraine, every couple of years there has been a bill introduced to the parliament to criminalize abortions. But all the attempts to do it have been unsuccessful, actually, because of the strong Soviet legacy, because abortion is seen as a social problem mostly, and also a personal right. So it's still something that we see today. And when I came to study in the US, I was very surprised by the importance of abortion for the US, both like for the American politics, both in the presidential campaigns and in local political campaigns. And it also inspired me to examine the ways abortion has been politicized and to compare it how abortion was politicized in the American and the Soviet context. So the language of abortion rights in the US is still limited to the view of abortion as a necessary evil. And abortion is very much considered as an exception, justified as a compensation for failures of education and contraceptive. Those who aim to protect women's reproductive rights, they present abortion as a matter of, mainly through social lens, as a matter of social status, access to health care and education. The social arguments and lens, as we know from the Soviet case, are not enough to protect women's reproductive rights. Until women are seen as victims of their circumstances and biology, victims of rape, of certain medical conditions that prevent them from having a healthy child, until their abortion needs any justification, women are in limbo, in which their full rights as citizens are suspended. The Soviet decree of 1920 was a state care for all women, particularly poor who couldn't afford abortion. But it was not enough. It lacked a political definition of abortion, substituting it for a social one. Yet it provided free abortion on demand without any conditions and limitations. And it is still something that most women in the world do not have. So it's my personal political dream is to live in a country where abortion is defined as a human right and as a part of a universal health care. So free abortion on demand without any conditions and justifications is something I hope women in Ukraine, in post-Soviet countries, and in the US will finally achieve in the future. But of course, I am not that optimistic, and I don't expect it to happen anytime soon. But that's something that the Soviet decree promised and unfortunately failed to achieve. That's it.
All right, thank you, Kateryna, for that fascinating presentation and that look both at the big picture at the Soviet level, as well as you know, this focus in on one doctor and her experiences, some of which may be kind of shared by other doctors. You know, many Soviet doctors were women, and many of those women were involved in gynecology and obstetrics. But of course, there's also sort of her particular experience, right? I think that in some ways she went further in trying to understand this experience than many others would. So now we do have some time for questions, and we can do those if you use the raise hand option. You can also type questions into the chat, and I'm happy to, as moderator, read them out for Kateryna. Give people just a second here to absorb. Okay. Well, giving people a second to absorb, I'll ask my question, which is, in terms of, you're saying that the kind of the 1920 decree, but also, you know, over the years, even with the kind of change that happened in the 30s, people from the Soviet Union inherited this kind of culture of this being something that is a social issue and something that at the end of the day, you know, women should be able to do. I just wanted to ask how in the responses to these proposals in Ukraine, like how do we see that? You know, what are these, you know, first of all, who brings up these proposals to make abortion illegal, you know, politically, where does this come from? And how could you give a little bit more information on how you think the responses are shaped by this history from the Soviet Union?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for this question, because I decided that because of time, I don't have that much time about this post-Soviet situation. So in Ukraine, it's mostly right-wing politicians connected to church who bring up these proposals to criminalize abortions, and they use this traditional, let's say, globalized argument that they want to protect unborn Ukrainian citizens, they want to protect fetuses, and the response is actually comes mostly from female organizations, and I think they are just the the top of the iceberg, because I think that even if not that many women, we don't really know what most of women think in Ukraine, because it's mostly the most politically active feminist organizations who oppose this projects from the perspective that it's a personal right. It seems that in general, this politicians do not really believe in possibility of that such bills would be turned into a law. Also, a lot of doctors, they openly oppose this bills. And there are in Ukraine, I guess, I'm sure you heard about this famine organization, famous performance group, who also organized like public performances in defense of women's reproductive rights. So I feel that it's a kind of a consensus actually now in Ukrainian society that such bills are not actually popular among people. So it's just a kind of way for those right-wing politicians to appeal to their very small audience, let's say in much more religious Western Ukraine. So that helps them to gain some political profit from introducing such bills. But in general, there is definitely no support for such new legislation, unlike Poland and I guess unlike Russia.
Okay. I see a hand up, but I can't tell. Oh, Laurie, hi. Yes, please.
Hi, thanks so much, Irina, for organizing this, and Katya for this incredibly informative and interesting presentation. I have a question that seeks to sort of connect the ways in which the Soviet period has more continuity, perhaps with the imperial period. One of the things that scholars of women in late imperial Russia have often argued is that liberal politics often failed women precisely because of issues like abortion. And the root of the cause of that was that they really did not understand women as what were sort of termed self-actualizing citizens, right? They really did not believe that women should or could make decisions about themselves, and that essentialist arguments about them being the subject of their bodies dictating their decisions rather than their brains was problematic. And that, so I heard a little bit of this sort of threaded through some of the arguments that you were making, especially with the anti-abortion arguments that began under Stalin. But even still, like when the abortion rights were restored in the 50s, it still seemed like there was this tension between the fact that, yes, women should, fundamentally have this right. It's a social problem, right? We don't want unwanted pregnancies and so forth. But, do women really have the ability to make these kinds of decisions? Can they do them in a rational way? So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I wanted actually to show that this is the question that we see from even before 1917. So those liberal doctors who were fighting on the side of women, who were presenting themselves as promoting women's interests, and they were using these words, very radical words, for the Russian Empire, that women are free and equal citizens, free and equal to men. At the same time, it's something that they were not able to address in their writings, because at the same time they always talk about women as some kind of they are always victims of their nature, because their nature impedes their ability to make rational decisions. And that's something that we also see in the Soviet case of this. The decree actually said that women are victims of capitalist exploitation, they are victims of their economic backwardness. And now we and then in the later Soviet debates, it was always this 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 dilemma that women are either careless and they don't really care about the harm to their health that they can cause by abortion, and then they don't care about the interest of the Soviet state. So we always see this this tension in a figure of a Soviet woman. So Soviet woman, she's equal to man. She's like she's a Soviet citizen, but at the same time, she's always there is always this problem that there is something that prevents her from being fully equal, from being like this person who can make fully rational decisions.
We have a question here in the chat that I wanted to pose, and then I see that Jacob has his hand up as well. But this question is from Matthew Brown, and he asks whether your research has found any public pushback or opinion against the legalization of abortion in the Soviet period, or was it sort of welcomed more or less unanimously by the public?
Against the legalization, so it's about 1955, I guess. Yeah, no, I guess it was mostly like in the press. It was definitely praised but it's official press, you know, and it was definitely praised, and I guess that was because what I read in the archives and what doctors argued even before 1955, that underground abortions were causing so many deaths, like at the in the early 50s there were years when it 2,000 women died a year from underground abortion. So many doctors were more or less publicly arguing for decriminalization. So yes, doctors were very much welcomed this new law.
Okay, and I guess, right, so in terms of public backlash or pushback, right, it's sort of hard to see in the official Soviet press of the 1950s, like what kind of dissenting opinions was there room for. Even, you know, even kind of post-Stalin, that period of the thaw, it wasn't so thawed necessarily. And so like I saw Jacob's hand, and then I think Alexandra, you unmuted, so you probably had a question as well, but I'll turn it over to Jacob first. Thank you.
Hi, Kateryna. Thank you very much for that very fascinating talk. You know, the part of your talk that I was just most interested in was about the doctor, you know, purposefully getting pregnant so that she could have an abortion to better understand her own practice and her own patients. I'm wondering if you found anything, or there's any commentary on, you know, her colleagues' reactions to that, or perhaps the hospital administration. Were people aware of this plan? Did they know she was doing this, or was it more clandestine?
Actually, my suspicion is that that she kind of like invented or like changed the story into this way that it was an experiment. She presented as a kind of experiment, but she wrote her memoir in 1989, and so it was like the end of the Soviet Union. And I said, like, my suspicion is just she for so many different reasons she decided to have an abortion, but also she wanted to show it as an experiment because she was a doctor. And no, I don't think that at that time when she had an actual medical procedure, she presented it this way to other doctors. But at least she, that's actually the one of the biggest mysteries for me. How she actually saw it it was in 1961 when she had this abortion herself, how she envisioned this at that time, but it's really hard for me to say. But at that time it was actually quite easy for her to obtain an abortion because she was a doctor. She had so many colleagues, friends at the hospital. So I don't even think that she had to explain that.
Irina, you're muted. I don't know if you're...
No, I was just telling you to go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. Kateryna, thank you for your very informative presentation. And I would like to know your opinion about, so in 1920, I assume Soviet Union was the first country to have decriminalized abortion. And I wonder if you think that if it influenced other non-socialist countries to do the same or not. I mean, if you read about it, what impact, what was the influence for other socialist, non-socialist countries?
Definitely it had a lot of influence. It had for example, I know about the Czechoslovakia. There were also feminists, mostly like social feminist groups, who were also calling for decriminalization, and they also had introduced these bills into the parliament to decriminalize abortions, but it was it never happened. But for them, but it was actually for those who wanted to decriminalize abortions, they were referring to the Soviet case as a successful example. And for example,
you're talking about before the Second World War, about
about the interwar period. Yeah, it's 20s, the late 20s, and then and for the Catholic Church, for example, in Czechoslovakia, it was definitely a communist threat. So that was something that they used this Soviet example as a kind of like a very negative one. And also for for Germany, for interwar Weimar Republic, socialists, like doctors and feminist movement, they were also using this Soviet example a lot, and they were very interested in even in the medical statistics on like whether the abortion was really safe. They were like a lot of doctors who were really interested in this kind of like medical information, but also like politically this Soviet decree was used as a like banner of progressive used by the socialist progressives in many European countries.
Thank you.
So thank you. We are just about out of time, but if somebody had one last burning question, I feel like we could accommodate that. But I'm also happy to end here, having our wonderful presenter having answered so many of our audience members' interesting questions. So
I have one very quick, curious question. Have there been any follow-ups in these countries in which they decriminalized abortion in terms of the outcomes with women who have experienced them in a different under different regimes?
Sorry, can you repeat? Like in which countries?
Well, has there been any follow-up? Well, in the Soviet Union or even in Czechoslovakia and Germany, of women who have experienced abortions and the consequences of doing so. Any studies of that nature in these countries, in the socialist countries?
I know only about the Soviet Union. So in the Soviet Union, there were in the 20s, there were enormous amount of like medical articles about the complications of abortions and like studies about the safety of procedure. But it was only in the 20s until this Stalinist law of 1936, and then in the 50s and the 60s they also started to do some studies, but abortion was not a popular topic, and basically the influence of abortion on women was mostly studied in the 20s and 30s, so not in the late Soviet Union. I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you, that's fine, thank you. It's not an easy question to answer.
It's probably a paper on its own or a dissertation on its own. Here we are at almost the exact 1 hour mark. So I want to thank Kateryna for her presentation and the questions that it raises about both kind of, it's always kind of reflecting on the way that we talk about these issues today here, today in Ukraine and elsewhere in the former Soviet Union. And how also, how that's embedded in the kind of legal history, the kind of medical history and political history. So I look forward to what will surely be a fascinating monograph in, shortly, in a year or two. No pressure. Okay, and I want to also thank everyone for coming and your attention and for asking great questions. This week we have Albanian and Persian Culture Night coming up tomorrow, as well as a talk by ethnomusicologist Dave Fossum on Wednesday about kind of copyright and folk music in Turkey, which I'm very looking forward to. And I hope to see some of you there. But thank you. One last round of applause for Kateryna. I will do the applauding, the physical applauding. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes.
For inviting
Thank
me.
you so much. And
opportunity to share.
Yes. And obviously, if you have any questions or would like to be in touch with her, please, you can feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to make that connection. As I said, even though it's been remote and on Zoom, Kateryna is with us here in Tempe, and we'd love to kind of have her take part in Melikian Center events this coming academic year. So, all right, thanks everybody. Have a good one.